The Battle of Lake Erie is one of the most famous battles of the War of 1812. Although a small battle in a distant theater of the war, it had great consequences for the nation. Two of the best-known phrases in U.S. naval history, "Don't give up the ship," and "We have met the enemy and they are ours," both are associated with this battle. Part of our mission at the Erie Maritime Museum is to interpret the battle and the Lake Erie campaign of 1813. We strive to provide an understanding of what it was like for the participants of that time. In the U.S. Brig Niagara, we have a new ship that carries on a centuries-old tradition, the craft of seamanship in square rig. Sailing the ship now gives us a first-hand experience of the seaman's working environment, but gives no inkling of the ship in action. Since Niagara was first and foremost a warship, the museum felt it was important to provide visitors with a vivid glimpse of the three-dimensional reality of a naval battle. A recreation was needed, and thus the live fire exhibit was born. But how to go about it was the question. While the written record offers some descriptions, there are no visual clues. This is before the invention of photography. Paintings were most often done long after the battle, and not by people who had been there. In order to make the exhibit as accurate as possible, the museum decided that an experiment to recreate the action of battle was necessary.
This turned out to be more difficult than first meets the eye. Building the replica ship section was straightforward. Enough was known about the original construction from the wreck brought up in 1913. But finding the right guns was the far greater challenge. Even if original guns of the right type could be found, it would be irresponsible to fire them now with a full charge and projectile. Firing live rounds puts much more strain on the guns than firing small blank saluting charges. We quickly realized that new guns were needed.
New naval cannons of early 19th century design, capable of firing live rounds, are not an off-the-shelf item. After a search of available bidders was made, the museum determined to be its own contractor, working with several local firms to get the new guns built. Pat Claxton, a retired mechanical engineer and longtime Niagara League volunteer, took on the role of project engineer.
The guns were cast around a seamless steel tube with a welded breech plug. We chose malleable iron for the material, as it's about 3 times as strong as the original cast iron. Modern machining methods were used to true up the bore, clean the castings, drill the touch holes, make the elevating screws and the parts for the gun carriages. The wooden gun carriages were made by a local contractor.
Proof firing the guns was accomplished with assistance from the local National Guard unit at a firing range near Meadville in April of 1996. It was necessary to prove the guns were safe by subjecting them to at least the pressures they would encounter when fired with projectiles. Sand was used in place of cannonballs for safety reasons. The proof firing was done with an electrical charge from a bunker and recorded with a remote camera in case a gun blew up. After firing, they were visually inspected and sounded for cracks. Dye penetrant and ultrasonic testing were also carried out on critical areas. The next phase in developing the exhibit was to build a replica hull section to the same timber dimensions of the same wood types recorded from the original ship. There were 2 objectives in staging the live fire exercise. One was to learn something about the capability of this type of gun for range and accuracy. The other was to replicate the effects of British fire upon Perry's ships. The guns were all externally 32-pounder carronades because this was the historically correct gun for Niagara. But only one was bored as a 32-pounder. Another was a 24-pounder, the largest British gun at the battle. and the rest were bored as 12-pounders, another common size. A broadside of 3, one of each size, was mounted on a trailer that would serve as the firing platform as well as transport.
Fire team, commence firing at will.
The day spent firing at the plywood targets told us that the spread increased with larger balls and charges. The 32-pounder had a truly wicked recoil, just as the historic accounts often described. The powder charge for this size ball in a carronade is 4 pounds. The opening shots of the Battle of Lake Erie had been fired at over a mile range from long guns, but few hits were made until the range closed, and most of the battle was fought at ranges of 100 to 200 yards. To replicate this situation, the guns were positioned to fire at the ship section from 200 yards and later repositioned to a range of 100 yards. The first 2 rounds at 200 yards were both misses, but from the 3rd shot on, hits were pretty consistent. We had the great advantage of shooting from a stationary position, at a stationary target. During a naval battle, the rate of fire would be the maximum that pumping adrenaline could produce, about 1 round per minute. The overriding need was to do it to them before they could do it to you. Rapid fire was dangerous to the gun's own crew, even with no enemy shooting back. Mistakes might be made in the loading, chief of which would be failure to extinguish sparks left in the gun from the last round. A premature discharge when loading the next charge would usually tear off the arm of the man ramming home the charge. In 1813, the powder charges would have been in flannel bags. Today, the practice is to roll black powder charges in multiple layers of aluminum foil, greatly lessening the hazard. Safety is also increased by waiting 5 minutes after a shot before loading the next one. This time allows sparks to die, the gun to cool, and encourages the crew to concentrate on thorough cleaning and preparation, rather than taking any chances in emulating the speed of naval gun crews in action. The results were surprising. The damage to the exterior was less than expected. Cannot put your fingers through the hole made by a 24-pound ball. The ship's sides are about 15.5 inches thick, 3 inches of outside oak planking over a 10-inch deep oak frame with 2.5 inches of pine ceiling or inner planking. As the ball passes through, the shattered timber has no place to go because of the dense wood packed behind it. So the fibers spring back into place, nearly filling the hole. The exact size of the ball and point of impact can be seen in a line of broken paint, but one cannot see daylight through the hole. The inside is a different story. As the ball crashes through, the timber closest to the inside starts to tear away since it lacks the support of further layers. The effect is much like an entrance and exit wound in flesh. The exit wound is larger. Splinter wounds to crew members usually meant multiple wounds ranging in size, from tiny punctures to toothpick-sized splinters, on up to dismemberment from heavy, jagged pieces 4 feet long. Solid-shot ammunition did not carry an explosive charge, as do modern shells, but the splinter damage was the equivalent of shrapnel. After each round, the gun is wormed to extract the remnants of the powder bag, and the gun is swabbed with a wet sponge of sheepskin fleece, followed by a dry sponge. The powder bag is rammed home and must be seated all the way to the base of the bore. The vent tender tests that it is home by inserting a brass prick to feel for the powder bag. A wad is then rammed home to provide a better seal for the charge to push against. In 1813, the wads were layers of old rope and canvas, but we have found no illustration or instruction as to exactly how they were made. Ours are cut from layers of corrugated paper. Next, the ball is rammed with an outer wad to keep it from rolling out on the next roll of the ship. With the complete charge fully home, the gun is run out to firing position. If the gun discharged inboard with no run to absorb the recoil, it may be torn off its carriage. Once run out, the gunner checks for aim, both for side-to-side training and for elevation. When the gun is in position, the prick is inserted again and pushed home to break into the powder bag. Notice the gunner stands to the side and only grabs the sides of the prick. If the charge goes off, the prick will not be shot through his hand, nor will he be crushed by the recoiling gun. The priming quill is inserted down the touch hole. In 1813, these were goose quills filled with a mixture of turpentine and fine powder. The present-day substitute is a soda straw. When all is checked and ready, the order is given to fire. The gun is discharged by touching a slow match to the priming quill. These guns are seriously loud, even with hearing protection. It is hard to imagine the difficulty the original crew had communicating in battle while standing close to the guns for multiple firing. Permanent hearing injuries were frequent. During the battle for upwards of 3 hours, nothing could be heard but the roar of our own cannon, the crash of ball through our timbers, and the shrieks of the wounded. Surgeon's mate Usher Parsons aboard the Lawrence. Grape shot was also used at 200 yards, but the spread was very wide. At 100 yards, the grape shot was more closely grouped and the canister was usable. Grape shot is so named for the appearance of the ammunition, which consists of multiple small iron balls bound in a cloth bag. Grape and canister could cut up sails and rigging, but the primary purpose was to decimate the opposing gun crews. In all, 25 hits were made on the target. Considering the original rate of fire, probability of hits, and duration of action, we estimate the resultant damage represents the Lawrence about halfway through the Battle of Lake Erie. This was an extremely hard-fought battle, with the Lawrence nearly a complete wreck by the end. The condition of this ship's section is horrible enough and probably represents the ending condition at most battles. We were reluctant to inflict further damage on the section because it had to survive several crane lifts and a 300-mile drive back to Erie for installation in the museum. The professional crew of the Niagara were the sailors, carpenters, and gunners for this exercise, with assistance from Niagara League volunteers and National Guardsmen. The entire exercise, including removal of the guns from the ship, transporting them over 300 miles, and returning them to the ship, took over 3 weeks. There is a reason people don't do this sort of thing very often.
The live fire project yielded many lessons. We now have a much better understanding of the capabilities of naval gunnery in the age of fighting sail. More importantly, we have a better appreciation of the dangers faced by the men who served. The Battle of Lake Erie was a very hard-fought battle. The overall casualty rate was 24% on both sides, which is quite high.
The crew of the Lawrence stood by their guns as a slow grinding attrition over 2.5 hours rendered about 80% casualties. To have suffered 22 dead and 61 wounded out of an effective crew of only 103 shows a seldom equaled level of courage and devotion to duty. To win the battle, Perry in the end had to give up the ship he was on and transfer to the Niagara. The real motto was "Don't give up."